Sarah Jennings's first night on the shift at St. Elizabeth Hospital began uneventfully. The old, loudly humming elevator slowly lifted her to the 6th floor, home to the main operating theaters. Warned in advance by colleagues about the peculiarities of night shifts, Sarah was skeptical. As a newcomer, she believed the experienced nurses were just teasing her to prepare her for the shift. Cold LED lights illuminated the long, sterile corridors that branched off like a labyrinth. Only the sound of her footsteps and the occasional rumble of the ventilation system could be heard. Captivated by her first impressions of the hospital at night, Sarah began her rounds, checking on sleeping patients and automatically running equipment. By the end of the first hour, as she finally reached the sterile area of the operating rooms, something happened that defied her logic. Under the door of operating room number 5, faint flashes of light leaked out. Sarah stopped to listen. Open doors were nonsensical. The operating equipment should have been turned off, and the entrance locked. The more she listened, the clearer she heard a soft rustling, as if someone was gently moving inside. Gathering her courage, Sarah quietly approached the door and peeked inside. The dimly lit room was oddly illuminated only by the weak light from the ceiling lamps, which should not have been on. The operating table was empty, but to her left, by the wall, stood a large shadowy figure, sending chills down her spine. The figure did not move. "It's just an old medical training mannequin," she thought, trying to calm herself. As she moved closer, she suddenly heard a clear whisper. It was so soft that Sarah could barely make out the words, "Help me. Please." A cold sweat overcame her as she realized that the whisper came not from the mannequin, but from beneath the floor, literally out of nowhere. She bolted from the operating room without looking back. Returning to the staff room, Sarah locked the door behind her and sat down, trembling. She needed to gather her thoughts. Could these have been hallucinations from fatigue? She knew she needed to report the incident, but who would believe such a thing? Then she remembered the video cameras that should be in every operating area. Deciding to check the footage, Sarah headed to the monitoring room, where she could verify what truly happened that night. What she would see on the video could explain everything, or make her regret her curiosity. Sarah entered the monitoring room, her heart barely keeping pace. Clicking the mouse, she launched the camera recordings aimed at the operating area. The screen displayed dimly lit corridors and sealed doors of the operating rooms. Sarah held her breath as she searched the frames for the night she heard the whisper. When the video reached the time of the whisper, Sarah paused the playback. There she was, approaching the door of operating room number 5. The scene was quiet until a mysterious figure appeared. Not the shadow Sarah had seen, but a person in an old-fashioned medical gown. Sarah's grip tightened on the mouse. The figure slowly turned towards the camera, its face pale and eyes lifeless. The video then showed a frightened Sarah running away. Something was wrong. The figure in the gown had vanished, as if it had never been there. Sarah shuddered but decided to review the recordings with sound. Maybe she could hear what that creature was whispering. The whisper was clear and distinct. "Join me." It sounded desperate and eerie. Sarah looked around the room, making sure she was alone. A cold sweat ran down her back. She had to find out who was in the video. Searching the hospital archives might shed some light. Hours of searching led Sarah to old records of Dr. Edward Miller, a doctor who died in that very operating room during an accident in the 1950s. The photograph in the file was hauntingly familiar. It was the face from the video. Sarah felt deceived. She returned to the operating room, driven by the idea of meeting the ghost and uncovering the truth. She opened the door to room number 5 and stepped inside, knowing the video had not shown the whole truth. Instantly, the door slammed shut and the lights went out. The whisper returned, louder and more demanding than before. "You are here, with me, forever." Darkness engulfed the room, and the sounds became more real. Sarah screamed, but her cry was lost in the eternal silence of the operating room. The next morning, colleagues found the door to operating room number 5 locked. There was no one inside, only a faint whisper echoing through the empty space. Sarah Jennings was never seen again. Jonathan, tired of the monotonous routine of working in a supermarket, decided it was time for a change. He was looking for a job where he could utilize his skills in observation and patience, and when a vacancy for a night watchman at an old hospital on the outskirts of the city appeared, he applied without hesitation. The hospital, built in the 1950s, had over time become a storage facility for medical equipment, but still carried an aura of mystique and secrets of the past. Jonathan spent his first workday getting acquainted with his duties. He needed to patrol the vast building, checking locked doors, ventilation shafts, and responding to any alarm signals. He listened attentively to the instructions of the senior watchman, who explained the nuances of each corridor and the forbidden zones where entry without urgent need was prohibited. As the sun set, it was time for his first night shift. Jonathan donned his uniform, took a flashlight and keys, and embarked on his first round. He felt slightly uneasy walking through the empty corridors, where the echo of his footsteps resonated in the silence, and old photographs of doctors on the walls watched him with mysterious gazes. Approaching midnight, he reached the old part of the hospital, which used to be a psychiatric ward. It was colder here, and the air was saturated with the heavy scent of aging and mold. Jonathan slowly opened each door, peeking inside with his flashlight. In one room, it seemed something rustled, but when he entered, he found only emptiness and old medical charts scattered across the floor. Continuing his patrol, he entered a long corridor with closed doors at the end. There was no sound but his own footsteps. Suddenly, amidst the silence, Jonathan heard a soft whisper. Stopping, he strained his ears. The whisper sounded so real, as if someone was talking right nearby. The sound was incredibly soft and melodic, and the words were barely distinguishable. He cautiously approached the door from behind which, he believed, the whispering came, and placed his hand on the handle. When he cautiously opened the door, he was greeted by a breathtaking sight. A large, dimly lit hall, illuminated only by moonlight penetrating through dirty windows, lay before him. In the center was a circle of old wooden chairs, and in the middle, a small table scattered with tools resembling surgical instruments. Chains and shackles fixed to the walls suggested the grim experiments that had taken place here. The air was thick, and the scent of metal and old blood was perceptible even through a pinched nose. Jonathan felt that something nefarious had occurred here, something that should not have been forgotten. He began to carefully examine the room when suddenly he heard a slight rustling behind him. He quickly turned around, and in the darkness of the corridor leading from the hall, he saw a shadow quickly pass by, like a ghost, leaving behind only the sound of rustling and a sense of cold. This night marked the beginning of his quest for the truth about the hospital's forgotten and silenced past, a quest that would forever change his fate. The shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Jonathan alone with the eerie stillness of the abandoned hall. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat dampened his back. Despite the fear gripping him, his curiosity pushed him forward. He needed to understand what had transpired in this forsaken part of the hospital. Jonathan stepped cautiously into the corridor from where the shadow had retreated. His flashlight cast long dancing shadows against the cracked walls, each flicker making his pulse quicken. The air grew colder as he moved deeper into the labyrinth of the old psychiatric ward. As he ventured further, he stumbled upon a room that was different from the others. This room, sealed off from the rest by an old rusted lock, piqued his interest. After a moment's hesitation, he broke the lock with a heavy push against the door. The room was dark and filled with a thick layer of dust that told of decades of neglect. Old patient records, faded and yellowed with age, littered the floor. Jonathan picked up one, squinting in the dim light to read the faded ink. The files contained notes on experimental treatments that were not just unethical, they were horrifying. Descriptions of patients being subjected to extreme temperatures, isolation, and surgical procedures without consent filled the pages. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the magnitude of the suffering that had occurred in this very room. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with the silent screams of those who had endured these experiments. Jonathan felt a profound sadness and a growing anger at the injustices that had been perpetrated here. Determined to uncover more, he continued his exploration, each step taking him deeper into the bowels of the hospital. He came across an old operating theater, the once sterile room, now a haunting shell of its former self. Instruments of torture rather than healing lay scattered around, rusted and stained with old blood. As he stood there, absorbing the horror of the place, a sudden sound broke the silence, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Jonathan spun around, flashlight in hand, searching for the source. The beam of light landed on a small, hidden door at the far end of the theater. With his heart in his throat, Jonathan approached the door, each step resonant with the echoes of the moans. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pulled it open. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Swallowing his fear, he descended. The stairs creaked under his weight, and the air grew mustier with each step. At the bottom, he found himself in a long, narrow tunnel. The walls were lined with cells, small and cramped. In the faint light, he could see scratch marks on the walls, the desperate marks of those who had once been imprisoned there. At the end of the tunnel, Jonathan found a room that appeared to have been used for group therapy sessions. Chairs were arranged in a circle, each one facing the center where a single chair sat under a dim light bulb that flickered sporadically. It was here, in this room, that Jonathan felt a palpable sense of despair and hopelessness. He knew then that he could no longer ignore the dark history of this place. He had to bring these truths to light, to ensure that the souls who had suffered here were remembered. With a new resolve, Jonathan left the basement, each step toward the surface strengthening his resolve to expose the dark past of the hospital and seek justice for the forgotten souls whose cries still echoed through its halls. Determined to expose the hospital's past and honor the memory of its victims, Jonathan began to gather evidence. He photographed old documents, torture instruments, and the remnants of cells. However, the deeper he delved into the secrets of this place, the more his own mind succumbed to the unseen forces lingering within the hospital's walls. Anxiety and fear increasingly overshadowed him. He began to hear whispers in his head, not only at night in the hospital, but also at home, in solitude. The whispers turned into voices that gave him no peace, insisting that he return and complete what he had started. Jonathan lost sleep, his health deteriorated, but he could not leave his task unfinished. One evening, he returned to the hospital, but this time his steps led him not to the archives, but to the basement where he first heard the moans. His flashlight suddenly went out, plunging him into absolute darkness. In panic and despair, he tried to find a way out, but in the darkness everything merged into one, making it impossible to navigate. He heard footsteps, not his own, but others, approaching him. They became faster, louder. Fear overwhelmed him, and he ran, stumbling and falling. He screamed, but his voice was lost among others, which now not only whispered but screamed back at him. Jonathan ran to the old operating room, where he locked himself inside. He waited for the footsteps to subside, but they never did. They circled around slowly, as if someone or something was waiting for him to come out. He spent the entire night there, huddled in a corner with his flashlight barely glowing. In the morning, when the hospital staff came for their shift, they found Jonathan in the operating room. He was sitting, leaning against the wall, his eyes open but his gaze hollow. He did not respond to their voices, to their presence. Jonathan never returned to his usual reality. He disappeared among the shadows he had tried so hard to uncover. We had just entered St. James Hospital early in the morning, the cold tile of the reception area beneath our feet. My son Oliver had been complaining of severe headaches for several days, and his condition was not improving. Both filled with anxious premonitions, we hoped for swift service. A nurse with a skeptical look escorted Oliver to the neurologist's office, leaving me waiting in the lobby. The place was filled with the whispers of other patients and the distant sound of footsteps. The wall clock mercilessly ticked away time, turning each minute into eternity. More than 3 hours had passed when it finally seemed to me that something was wrong. No one had come out to update me, no news on my son's condition. My heart pounded faster and faster. Approaching the registration desk, I noticed the nurse pause for a moment, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. "How is my son, Oliver? Why is it taking so long?" My voice shook with fear. "Oliver. Sir, no one with that name has checked in today," she replied, flipping through her records. My heart skipped a beat. I urged her to check again, and then once more. There was no record of my son anywhere. Instead of answers, I was plunging deeper into a maze of oblivion. Oliver's mysterious disappearance became a reality I refused to accept. Searching for witnesses or any clues, I wandered the hospital corridors. Every corner seemed suspicious, every whisper a call to action. In one of the abandoned wards, I stumbled upon an old medical chart lying on the floor. The name on it glimmered in the darkness. Oliver. But the date was from 10 years ago. I realized I was at the heart of a medical mystery that promised to be even more horrifying and unpredictable than I could imagine. My detective work began with analyzing old records and interviewing staff who had worked at the hospital for years. Most of them refused to talk or did so with evident nervousness. However, one of the senior doctors, Dr. Henry, agreed to help. He told me about a series of unusual disappearances of children in this ward that were never solved. "You know, many refuse to believe what happens here," he whispered. "But I've seen enough to know something's wrong with this part of the hospital. You must be careful." This conversation only fueled my interest and determination to get to the truth. I decided to spend the night in the hospital, hoping for new discoveries. However, what I uncovered that night surpassed all my wildest expectations. Waking up to strange sounds in the hallway, I realized that spending the night at the hospital had unveiled new mysteries before me. Recalling the conversation with Dr. Henry, who seemed to have disappeared with the darkness, I gathered all the documents I had found and decided to venture back into the corridors. With an increasing sense of incomprehensible events at the hospital, my thoughts became increasingly chaotic. Trying to focus, I went back to the main registration desk to inquire about Oliver again. But once more, there was no answer. I decided to check the surveillance cameras, hoping to find something that could aid me. Meeting a guard who reluctantly agreed to help after some hesitation, I gained access to the video archives. As I scrolled through the footage, I saw myself entering the hospital with Oliver, but then all recordings of him abruptly stopped. It was inexplicable. He had been with me, but he wasn't visible in the videos. The realization that the video recordings could have been tampered with made me further doubt my own memory. I started looking for more evidence and noticed the psychiatrist's office where I had once been taken for consultation. Deciding to take a look inside, I accidentally overheard a conversation between doctors. "He's very persistent in looking for his son, but the cameras only show him alone," one doctor said. "We need to calm him down before he creates more problems," another responded. This pushed me to take decisive action. I felt I was losing control over the situation, and my stay here was turning into something more than just searching for my missing son. The idea that I could be a victim of manipulation or experiments prompted me to act quickly. During another visit to the registration desk, I decided that my story needed to be heard. As I shared my version of events, a doctor decided to support me, stating that some things in the hospital indeed did not add up. This support gave me hope, but it also confirmed that there were things happening in the hospital that needed to be exposed. Now, I continue to fight not only for my own liberation, but also for the truth, which I hope will eventually lead me back to Oliver. I know he is waiting for me somewhere. On that dreadful November day, when the cold wind foreshadowed the imminent arrival of winter, Michael Johnson headed to the St. Luke's Memorial Medical Center in the small town of Asheville, Maine. It seemed like a routine visit, just another checkup for the persistent tingling in his side that had been troubling him for days. However, something ominous lingered in the air, as if the town itself was warning Michael of what was to come. Upon arriving at the hospital, he immediately sensed something amiss. The cold walls of the corridors seemed to swallow the light, leaving only dimness behind. Rare rays of sun that penetrated through the narrow windows flickered like dying candles. Michael grimly proceeded to the registration desk, where he was met by a nurse with an unusually pale face and dim eyes. She introduced herself as Susan Gray and led him deeper into the hospital. They stopped at room number 17, located at the end of a long corridor. While waiting, Michael felt each sound in the hospital taking on a sinister tone. There was whispering among the nurses around the corner, groans from the old ventilation system, and distant cries of a newborn from the upper floor. Every now and then, figures in white coats passed by, throwing suspicious glances his way, making everything seem like scenes from an old horror film. When the doctor entered the room, Michael instantly knew something was wrong. Dr. Richard Moore, a tall man with a nervous tremor in his hands, greeted him without a smile and began the examination. His questions about Michael's health sounded overly detailed, and his gaze darted anxiously around the room. After the examination, Dr. Moore suggested a quick and necessary screening, which Michael, despite his inner resistance, agreed to. He didn't realize how he ended up in the operating room, where the harsh overhead light blinded him. There, two men in masks awaited, barely speaking to each other. Michael's sense of alarm grew with each passing second, and the firm grip on his arms and legs only heightened his sense of despair. Suddenly, he realized they were planning to harvest his organs. But before anything could happen, the operating room door burst open. Susan Gray stood at the threshold, not with the calmness of a nurse, but with real terror in her eyes. She rushed towards Michael, pushing the men in white coats aside, and shouted that he was not the person they were supposed to operate on. The men initially looked confused, and then one of them pulled out a syringe with an anesthetic. Michael only saw a sharp movement of the hand before everything around him plunged into darkness. Waking up, he found himself in his own bed, with a bandage on his side where the tingling had been. Around him lay tranquilizers and doctor's notes about a minor surgical intervention that had been carried out for health reasons. Michael couldn't tell if it had been real or all just a nightmare. He knew one thing for certain: